Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Eternal Watcher, where I love to talk about anything related to science fiction or fantasy. Today, I'm going to be returning with another Doctor Who video, another entry into my podcast, The Best and Worst of Who, where each episode I, alongside a guest, discuss our favourite and maybe not so favourite stories of a certain Doctor's era. And today, I'm joined by Ryan to discuss the Peter Davison era, seasons 19 through 21. Hello, Ryan. How are you doing today?
Hello, I'm doing very well, thank you. Looking forward to talking about the Peter Davison era, an era of the show which is definitely has a lot of variety. That is definitely fair to say.
For those of you who haven't heard it before, Ryan and I are both guest co-hosts on a podcast run by Elliot's EMS Productions called KerVAM. I'll put a link to that in the description. And in the past, we, in the lead up to Legend of the Sea Devils, we discussed Warriors of the Deep. We certainly do enjoy discussing a good old, well, I say good, Peter Davison's story. We love talking about really bad monsters, like Erato comes up every episode.
Yeah.
I thought I'd make it tradition to talk about Erato, not just in KerVAM, but whenever I have someone from KerVAM on the podcast on my channel. So general thoughts, Ryan, on the Peter Davison era?
The Peter Davison era, it's an era of the show that I do quite enjoy, but it is sometimes very up and down in terms of quality. It's just whenever we do have some great stories, and we're definitely going to be getting onto those later on. But it's an era of the show that doesn't leave that much of an impact on me, especially when comparing it to past eras of the show, like whether it's the Tom Baker era or even the Second Doctor's era. It doesn't leave that much of an impact, even though there are some stories that do help raise it up a bit, and definitely is great stories that are worth mentioning in their own right. And I think that does what help make it somewhat watchable. But coming after the Tom Baker era, it does waver a bit in terms of quality.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel I was discussing with Luke, the guest I had on for the Sixth Doctor discussion, which I only recorded a couple of hours ago, how the Sixth Doctor's era might not be the best in quality, but has a very big personality. It's, certainly memorable and distinctive. I don't think this is at all. I feel it doesn't really have much of a personality. It feels like very generic Doctor Who, if you know what I mean. It's
it's in a way, it's kind of it. I think I mentioned this before on KerVAM. This particular era, and in a way, to a certain extent, all of 80s Who in general, kind of reminds me a lot of Doctor Who now with the Jodie Whittaker era, in that there are some things that are really good, other stuff really not so much. And in a way, I always regard Peter Davison as kind of the Jodie Whittaker of classic Doctor Who in some ways. They're both coming after Titanic Doctors. I mean, Peter Capaldi is certainly, for me, such a really good Doctor. And having Jodie come afterwards, her era just doesn't seem to have much in terms of personality, and it's the same situation with the Peter Davison era as well. And maybe this is part of the fact that, I don't know if this is going to be a controversial opinion or maybe jumping the gun a bit, but
listening.
I think Peter Davison might be my least favourite Doctor.
That is certain people I know on like Discord and stuff are not going to be happy with that. I can see where you're coming from. I can see where you're coming from. Like, I do know certain people who are huge fans of Five, and again, I can see why. It's like much like his era, he doesn't have as big of a personality. Like, his arc is kind of like learning to cope with the fact that he doesn't lack he does lack the competence of some of his predecessors, like Pertwee and Tom Baker, which I I kind of understand, but it goes on too long. He always acts like that, and I feel the only time he gets some real character development isn't even when one of his closest friends, Adric, dies. It's in his last story, The Caves of Androzani,
Yeah,
and that's a bit late.
exactly. And I think that's the problem. And the thing is with Peter Davison, and I definitely can understand that after the domineering figures of John Pertwee and especially Tom Baker, they wanted someone who was much more human, someone more relatable, more placid. And I totally get that. And having a more vulnerable doctor that doesn't always win despite his best effort, as is evident in the case of Earthshock, because, well, Magic dies. But even then, I just don't know what it is, but there isn't really that much to him because of his more of a placid personality. He doesn't really give him much of an opportunity to kind of shine. What ends up shining more are the guest characters involved in the story, and to some extent the companions, primarily, mostly in the case of Tegan, who is by far and away the most interesting character in the Peter Davison era, and indeed one of the best companions of 80s Who.
Yeah, I do feel like, what you were saying about them having a more human and relatable Doctor, absolutely. Like, we do need some sort of, relatability and more human doctors, like you were saying, to sort of balance it out a bit, because we need someone audiences can relate to, rather than the very wacky and eccentric fourth Doctor. Like, he wasn't so much in season 18 after JNT took over. Even then, he was still very alien. So it's nice to have something like that. But like, the more alien Doctors tend to be my favorites. The second Doctor, third, seventh, 12th. Yeah, those are my four favorite. And they're very alien and odd and eccentric, but to attract the majority, the casual viewers, they need someone like that. We've established that he might not be the best Doctor, and this might not be the best era. It's a very sort of bog standard era, I'd say. Like, there's some mediocre ones, there's some amazing ones, there's some awful ones. It's just kind of standard. So we might as well start off with a positive. Ryan, what's one of your favorites of this era?
In terms of stories, or in terms of characters? So.
How much you enjoy it? Just sort of.
I would say. Oh, sorry. What was which certain aspect of the era?
Just how much you enjoy it, like how much you would want to watch it right now.
That's a really tough question. I think if I'm in the right mood, I would definitely watch one of the best stories. Like, if Caves of Androzani was on, or Enlightenment, I would definitely watch those. But if I was given the opportunity to watch something like King's Demons, or Lord knows, Arc of Infinity, I think I would tend to avoid. As I said, it's. I think depending on the mood that I'm in, if I'm interested, I think I would definitely watch one of his best ones. I would say, I think, again, it's pretty much how I feel about the Jodie Whittaker era. Depending on the right sort of mood I'm in, whenever one of the best episodes is on, I would definitely wouldn't mind checking it out, but it doesn't completely grab me in the same way that some stories from Tom Baker's era would. If Tom Baker's era was to come on, and even if they put like a not as well done story like, say, Pirate Planet or State of Decay on, I would instantly watch those in a heartbeat. Whereas I don't know if Peter Davison really has many of those sort of, attention-seeking stories. Well, at least for me.
Yeah, I can see that. It's it is a very dividing era. There are I think there's a lot of very mediocre stories in here, to be honest. I struggle to pick. Like I've got like a list written down, four of my favorites, four of my least favorites. The rest of them I couldn't really sort very easily. Like I feel there's like eight or nine that are very easily categorized, and the rest are kind of in the air. Like, they could be either way. It's, sort of the 4 out of 10 to 7 out of 10 sort of range. So just pick one that's one of your favorites, and we'll have a talk about it.
I'll pick a story, very briefly, a story that, even though it's not in my top 5, it is a story that I am always fascinated by whenever it comes on, and that's Kinder.
Kinder, I can see that. Go on.
And I love the concepts of Kinder, like explore the idea of spiritualism, the nature of oneself, and just the concepts of like how evil corrupts you. It's such a really fascinating, weird story, and it just always draws me to it. And I don't know what it is. It's a unique story. It's not something that's really been done before, which I definitely give it props for. And I will also say that its sequel, Snake Dance, is also worth noting, even though it's not as solid as Kinder. It's still a worthy inclusion as well. I think both Mara stories, I think what I really liked was at least they were creative in how they tackled its concepts. And I think the Mara especially is quite a terrifying monster. The idea that it's kind of like a personification of evil in this sort of snake form. It is kind of creepy, and whenever the scenes where Tegan is possessed by it is really eerie and creepy, that with that reddish mouth, and that always stuck with me. And I could definitely understand why people would say it's one of the best of the 80s, even though it's not in my top 5 Davison stories. Those two are definitely worth mentioning.
Yeah, I feel I feel what JNT tried to do, like, he saw that season 17 was pretty stale. Like, while viewing figures were high, that was just because of ITV and all of that. And it actually wasn't that well received. But so I thought he tried to, do some more weird experimental stories, like Warrior's Gate in season 18. I mean, all of season 18 was very experimental, but that especially. And now we've got this. It's like lots of the Davison era is known for having, like, insane base leaders, spaceships, underground bases, science fiction. It's but this is more of like a weird, like not weird, like a softer science fiction. It's like more poetic and experimental, and it's interesting. Like like, it's not like the Mara just possesses Tegan and the Mara's using Tegan's body. It's like he's torturing her, and it's just really interesting. Like I do prefer Snake Dance, I'm gonna say. I prefer Snake Dance to Kinder, which I don't know if it is an unpopular opinion or not. I'm not too sure, but I do prefer Snake Dance. I feel mostly because, like, I prefer the side characters as well.
Yeah, I can see that. I can definitely see that.
Like Kinder, it's great, but I don't think it's overly memorable besides the main concept. Like, I don't remember the names of the side characters. So yeah, Kinder and Snake Dance are pretty good. So give us one that you don't like.
So
much to choose from.
I don't know if I should jump the gun in terms of my bottom 5, but one that didn't really leave that, I suppose, didn't leave that much of an impact on me, which is just sort of more of an average story. What you were saying, like, some stories are kind of mediocre, just average. One, again, while this isn't in my bottom 5, was a bit of in contention, and that was Fort to Doomsday.
Yeah, Fort to Doomsday is kind of the definition of mediocre for me.
Yeah, it's visually interesting. I'll give it that. It does have a lot of some solid visuals. I mean, yes, the catching the cricket ball in outer space thing was a little bit not quite well thought out. Some of the effects look a little bit ropey on that one, but everything else, like the visuals, like inside the spaceship and the design of the monitors, and I thought it was a really well designed episode. But the problem is, it just feels a little bit too generic, and some of the performances I do find a bit off. But then again, it was the first story of the Peter Davison era to be filmed. This was the first story they shot, and maybe that was the reason why some of the performances felt a little bit off, because they didn't work out what the dynamic was and how these characters should be. And yeah, maybe that's why it always felt a little bit off to me, because it just felt a little bit like they didn't work it out yet. And I think once they did more stories like The Visitation, Castrovalva, that's when it does. I think that's when it did start to get it right. And funny enough, Castrovalva, while it isn't in my top 5, that is also another one I would say is a pretty good solid one.
Yeah, I think Fort of Doomsday is often one that's not seen as good. It's not often seen as like abysmal as like Terminus, Time Flight, Warriors of the Deep, but it's okay. It's not one that I overly remember watching, although I have. It's like it's there, you know. If I'm going through it, if I'm going through like a marathon of watching it, I'm not going to say, "Yay," you know, Fort of Doomsday, but I'm not going to say, you know, I'm not going to just be procrastinating from watching it like I am with other stories in this era. It's sort of
kind of like, you know, kind of like with the Jodie Whittaker era, like whenever Praxeus or Legend of the Sea Devils, it's sort of in that same camp. It's just there.
Yeah, it's there.
Nothing special or awful. It's just there, and I think that's kind of what leaves it a bit unremarkable.
Yeah, I feel it's got some good stuff. Like, you know, it's visually quite nice, I feel. But like that ending bit where you've got the androids like dancing sort of at the same time, it's a bit weird.
And then just running away from the monitor while all that's going on, and then suddenly they shrink down the monitor in one of the most. I'm not gonna lie, when that happened, I bursted out laughing for a good solid 5 minutes when that happened, which I don't know is a good sign or not, but there you go.
Yeah. Season 19, I feel, is a very it has the most variety. Like, you know, we've got the weird Bidmead-esque Castrovalva. We've discussed Fort of Doomsday Kinder. We've got Black Orchid, the first like historical in years. Visitation, which is actually another historical, I guess. And Earthshock, which we might as well talk about Earthshock. What do you think of Earthshock, Ryan?
Yeah, well, jumping the gun, it is in my top 5, and it is a solid story. In a way, it kind of set a precedent for future 80s stories to a certain extent, because there was so much going on with this story. Like, they wanted to bring back the Cybermen after, how long has it been? About 6-7 years since they last were on screen. And the fact that they wanted to build up to their return, make it a big surprise, and just to go and show how big of a major deal it is, and also go an extra step further by killing off Adric, a companion at the end of it. It's clear that Eric Saywood wanted to make the Cybermen's return have a major impact on the show, and they certainly did. I mean, Earthshock, while isn't my favourite Peter Davison story or one of my favourite Cybermen stories, it's definitely a good, strong one regardless.
Yeah, I feel like I know Elliot's been talking about this on KerVAM a bit whenever we've discussed Earthshock in the past. The Cybermen returning is kind of the last very well-kept secret of Doctor Who's history. Like, no one knew about it. Like, it was completely a surprise, hence, you know, shock. And it's not like, like in the past we've had Dalek stories that have just been something of the Daleks in the opening credits, and we already know what the story's going to be about. And that there's going to be a Dalek chasing a companion in the cliffhanger at the end of episode 1. That's just standard. But we didn't have that. The last time we really got that was I don't know, the chase or the Dalek, maybe the Dalek's master plan or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the chase. I mean, that didn't have Daleks in the title, and I don't. Well, they might have kept it secret until the end of the Space Museum when the Daleks did show up. Maybe that was a big surprise moment. So audiences will be like, "Oh, the next one is a Dalek story."
Yeah, with Cybermen, you could sort of figure out from future stories what do we have next? Attack of the Cybermen, Silver Nemesis, which you can kind of guess, and it was probably marketed as one because of the 25th anniversary, even though it should have been a remembrance of the Daleks, but we're not going to go there yet. And then Rise of the Cybermen. Yeah, and then I suppose Army of Ghosts, maybe. I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, I think they did advertise beforehand that the Cybermen were going to be in it, so maybe that sort of played into it a bit.
I mean, I'm too young to remember Series 2's broadcast, but yeah, so it's kind of the last very well kept secret. No one really knew about it. As for the story itself, though, I don't know. It's the way I see it is, it's the Cybermen have returned. The story. There's not really much else there. It's kind of just a way to tell us that the Cybermen are still here, and look, they're back. And they wrote a story around it rather than writing them into the story. I don't know.
Yeah, I can kind of see that. I mean, if you were to take them out and put the Daleks or Davros in there, it wouldn't have made any major difference. But regardless, and I could definitely sort of see that. I mean, as I said, it's not one of my. If I was to do a top 10 Cybermen stories, I don't think it would be in the top 10. I mean,
same.
It's a solid story, but not one of the best Cyberman stories, or one of the best, one of the top 10 best stories of the 80s. Frankly, I still think there are some other ones that I do think are more worthy of that, but and in a way you mentioned that you felt it was sort of the last one that sort of best kept Doctor Who secret. In a way, they're sort of returned, and I've seen this theory online, and I think there is a bit of truth to it, that in a way this story kind of set a precedent for 80s Who that kind of damaged it in a little bit of a way, because after that they were fixated on bringing back every legacy Doctor Who monster or villain. After this, we had the Master. Then in season 20, we had Omega, the Mara again,
the Black Guardian.
The Master again and again. Keep bringing back the Master. And also the 5 Doctors. You had all these different monsters, and Davros coming back, and the Silurians and the Sea Devils, and this also sort of continued on in Colin Baker's era, Sylvester McCoy's era as well. It just sort of, it's in the fact that they became so fixated on wanting to bring a returning enemy back, it ends up kind of diluting them in some ways, and rather than moving forward and doing something creative, they kind of, by bringing these enemies back again and again, it does sort of become a bit too self-indulgent. I mean, I can understand why they'll bring some enemies back because it was the 20th anniversary year, but by doing it repeatedly afterwards, it does make things a little bit too repetitive and stale, and in a way, Earthshock was sort of the beginning of that because of how much they made out of a big deal of the Cybermen coming back.
Yeah, I do see what you're saying. There are a lot of returning villains. You have one Dalek story per era, one Cyberman story per era in the 80s. And then obviously you've got, Sontarans, Silurians, Sea Devils, the
Davros,
Master,
the Rani.
Omega. Yeah. I mean, the Rani kind of was introduced in the 80s, but yeah, still came back. But yeah, Earthshock, I don't know. Here's a question for you, because we've been talking about a certain other Cyberman story, Attack of the Cybermen, in the Sixth Doctor discussion. Which do you prefer out of Attack of the Cybermen and Earthshock?
Earthshock any day. I think Attack of the Cybermen, and I could see past what they were going for, but it just didn't leave that much of an impact on me. The Attack, it just felt like a little bit of a it felt like they were trying to be bigger than Earthshock to some extent, by bringing in more Cybermen, the Cyber Controller, Telos, it was bringing in all this continuity and baggage, and I think that just sort of hurt the story a bit. I just felt like it was Eric Saywood's attempt of trying to be bigger and better than Earthshock to a certain extent. In a way, it's kind of the opposite of what he did with the Daleks, with Resurrection and Revelation, because Resurrection, I don't think is that great, but Revelation was such a major improvement. And it's kind of the other way around with the Cybermen, whereas I think Earthshock is great and Attack of the Cybermen is not so great.
I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball here and say I actually prefer Attack of the Cybermen to Earthshock.
Wow.
I definitely see what you mean about the continuity and the baggage. It does kind of weigh it down. Like, I do like a bit of continuity here and there. It makes it feel more connected. Like, a lack of continuity is why I didn't like Series 11 of New Who, because there was nothing. Like, there was literally nothing there, no references at all. It could have been a different show. But I just feel that it has a very a cinematic feel to it. Like, I feel they spent like most of the budget on this in Revelation of the Daleks for season 22. I do quite like the 45-minute runtime, and yeah, I do prefer it to Earthshock generally. But there we go.
I just feel like the first half of it, I just felt like part one, the first half of it, just felt like it has such sluggish pacing for me. Like, you have the Doctor and Perry just sort of stood in the TARDIS for a long time and then walking aimlessly around London for a bit. And it's the same thing with Lytton dawdling too much on prepping the plan. It just felt like there wasn't a sense of a good, strong sense of pace and energy with that first part. It just felt a bit sluggish. And I did feel like with part two, it did pick up a bit, which is maybe one of the reasons why it didn't stick with me, is because the pacing was very off. Whereas with Earthshock, I did feel like it had a good, steady pace throughout.
Yeah, I definitely do see what you mean there. Anyway, we're not talking about the Colin Baker era. So I thought we could talk about a certain story, which so we've talked about one I find quite overrated, Earthshock. Arc of Infinity. It's not that bad. It's not great. It's absolutely below good. It's kind of mediocre, but it's not. I don't think it's as bad as everyone says. What are your thoughts on Arc of Infinity, Ryan?
Oh boy. I'm afraid I'm gonna have to. I'm in the camp that thinks it kind of deserves the hate, because I actually watched this yesterday in preparation for this, just to see if it was that bad. And I had a bit of a tough time getting through it, to be honest. It just feels like a lot of aimless. I think it does suffer the most from having just very bad pacing, just really sort of plodding storytelling. I mean, Johnny Byrne started off good with Keeper of Traken, but I just feel like every time he returned, he just got less and less good with Arc of Infinity, and then Warriors of the Deep being the absolute rock bottom. And with Arc of Infinity, you have this convoluted plan by Omega about wanting to get the Doctor's body or wanting to gain some essence of him to kind of create a new body of himself. It's never really explained, I don't think, and how he's able to know. It seems like, and also the Time Lords just suddenly blame the Doctor and wanting to kind of they say the only way to stop Omega is to destroy the Doctor, which I think is the most extreme, one of the most extreme things the Time Lords could do. It's a bit like, are you sure you need to go through with this? And just a lot of the Time Lords just being really mean and snippy for no good reason. I mean, I know they've always been sort of like not great people, but even then I just felt like this is a bit extreme even back then, and not so many coincidences, like Tegan's cousin just happened to be in Amsterdam at the same time, just so that Omega lands coincidentally at that same place, and so when Tegan shows up, it just felt like so many coincidences happening at once. And the dialogue I found pretty creaky in places, and I just don't know what it is. It just felt like, I don't know what it was. I just felt like it just got less interesting as it went on. The only thing I will give it credit for is Peter Davison's portrayal of Omega in the last part. Yes. I will say he actually did a good job of playing a different character and adding to some extent a bit of humanity to Omega. So that's the one thing I will give it credit for. But apart from that, I really struggle with this story, and I just felt like, and I always found Omega to be a fascinating villain, and I don't think this did anything to further develop him or make him more memorable. It kind of made him a bit less interesting. He wasn't this sort of tortured, insane villain with an understandable reason. He just became another generic, one-dimensional bad guy in this story, and I don't think his new look is that much better than his previous one. At least his previous look had a bit of a personality to it, whereas I don't really get that from this. And the less said about the bloody Ergon, the better.
Yeah, that kind of sums up the things I don't like about the story. However, what you were saying about Peter Davison's portrayal of Omega, I do think it kind of, really does elevate the story. I feel it's quite brilliant. Like episode 4 is most of the story. It's like episode 4 is 2 episodes worth of content, and the first 3 episodes is 1 episode. They should have definitely lost an episode or 2 and had more clear, uniform pacing. And this definitely isn't in my top 5. It probably isn't even in my top 10. It's in my bottom half of stories. But it isn't. I still don't think it's that bad. I feel it's a decent sci-fi story, and I'm a sucker for Gallifrey. I love Gallifrey stories. I just think it's really interesting to see Gallifrey and how, understanding how corrupt they are and quite, stupid, to be honest. And I do find it quite interesting how they used to be portrayed as really high and mighty and almost ethereal and fairy tale like gods. And then we actually see them, and it's just they're idiots. And I think it's quite interesting to see that and why the Doctor left.
Yeah, in a way. And what people say about the fact that they felt the Time Lords lost some mystique to them as time went on. I do, in a way, this story was I think it was a good example of them sort of kind of losing that mystique a little bit. I mean, I don't know what it is. Whenever the Time Lords are not these powerful, almighty people, when they're just portrayed as these generic, bumbling bureaucrats, it kind of makes them a bit less interesting. And I think the story sort of contributed to that, although I don't think it was the start of all of that. I think in a way, Invasion of Time was sort of the start of it, and this is just the continued result of that, which goes to some extent why Russell T Davies and definitely Chris Chibnall wanted to get rid of them. I think because they didn't want that baggage of the Time Lords and how they ended up being sort of impacting modern Who to a certain extent.
Yeah, absolutely. I do feel the Time War was the right decision, especially since they will have had, like, I bet the majority of the people who tuned in to watch Rose had not watched Doctor Who before. Like, so if they're talking about all the stuff about Gallifrey and, you know, loads of returning monsters, then they'd be a bit put off, but they sort of ease people into it with, you know, the Daleks first, then the Cybermen the next season, and then some more of both. And then in season 4, they brought back the Time Lords for the end of time. You know, it's sort of, and the Master for season 3 as well. It just gradually did it, and I quite like that, especially since I started with New Who. And if I'd been, you know, if there was a whole Gallifrey story in series 1, I would have been very confused. And I remember watching The End of Time. I was like, should I know who this Rassilon is? Like, what's going on? You know, like it was just all a bit too much, you know. So yeah, Arc of Infinity, I don't think it's that bad. It's not good, but it's kind of underrated.
I will say, even though it is unfortunately in my bottom 5, it's definitely not the top spot. That honor certainly goes to another infamous story that I've talked about plenty before.
Yes, and we'll get onto that.
Okay, so yeah, with Arc of, I will say, looking at my bottom 5, Arc of Infinity is at number 3 on the list.
Yeah.
That is number 3. By the way, I would say bottom, my number 4, number 5 are stories that I'm kind of like 4 to Doomsday are very middling. I always flip back and forth whenever I look at these stories, because in a way, I do like some of the ideas in them. But again, like 4 to Doomsday, they don't leave that much of an impression on me, and they are both Terminus and the King's Demons.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I must confess, I haven't even seen the King's Demons. I haven't actually watched every Peter Davison story. I've watched the vast majority, but yeah, not King's Demons.
Am I okay to sort of? Are you okay with spoilers or?
Yeah, go ahead. I know the Master's in it, and it's apparently quite rubbish.
Yeah, I mean, they do try and make it a little bit of a surprise about the Master returning, and that's the big cliffhanger for part 1. But it's just you can clearly tell it's him because he's in disguise, and you can tell it's him. He has a bit of a dodgy wig and trying to put on a ridiculous French accent in the story. But even then, you can clearly tell that it's Anthony Ainley. I do sort of like the idea that the idea of trying to mess with history to a certain extent and alter events surrounding King John and what was going on during that time, but I just don't know if this is really a Master story. It feels more like it should be the monk doing this, because, I mean, that was the whole thing with the meddling monk during the Time Meddlers, that he was messing about with history for his own needs. And this is something that just seems a bit beneath the Master. If he really wants to mess about with history and the history of King John, surely why didn't he just go back and murder him straight away at where he lived, rather than just go ahead with this sort of copy of him by using this shape-shifting robot to do his dirty work? It just seems a little bit far-fetched even for the Master, and the story just kind of feels a little bit half-baked to a certain extent, because maybe it's because of how short it was, and the fact that when this was made, it was made during a time when there was like an industrial strike going on. So maybe some of those factors might contribute to why the story is very unmemorable. But yeah, it didn't leave that much of an impact on me. And it's the same situation with Terminus as well.
Yeah, Yeah, I've not seen the King's Demons, as I've said, but I I do kind of want to, because it seems like a very curious, like I'm very curious to find out um what it's like, because it seems like a very interesting story in the sense that, like, what the things you've just said, like, what the master's like in it, how Chameleon fits into it all. I'm just curious to watch it. It's one of those that I really do want to see. Um, I and as for Terminus, we might as well start to talk about Terminus here. That is like my third least favorite Peter Davison story.
Wow.
Um, it's just it's boring. It's so boring. Like,
Yeah.
it's the middle story in the Black Guardian trilogy, and they didn't need this. Like, it serves absolutely no purpose whatsoever, and it tries to like make the origin of a universe on the fuel leak of this spaceship, and it created the universe. It was like, it's really confusing. And then obviously you've got all the weird stuff with Nissa going on. I don't know what was happening there. And then, oh, hang on, I think something's wrong with your mic. It's like you might be covering it.
Oh.
Yeah, there we go.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, the stuff with Tegan and Turlo just aimlessly walking around in vents or in tunnels.
It's
I mean,
it's, I've seen some like memes about them going around in vents like it's Among Us or something, which I do find quite amusing. Especially since Turlo is basically the imposter.
Yeah.
But and the fact that he's at the start of the story as well, like the stuff with the Black Guardian, he's like screaming at this, the object that the Black Guardian gave him, and no one seems to bat an eyelid. It's just all of that stuff. It's just very, very strange. It's just the fact that they're doing a trilogy of stories that are connected, and they do the most weird, disconnected story possible. It's like, what? It just doesn't make any sense. It's like, it kind of reminds me of Village of the Angels in Flux. It doesn't really like do anything for the overall narrative story. It's just there to be a Weeping Angel story, much like this is just there to be a story, and a really boring, like, it's just dull. It's not memorable. It's boring. The companions don't do anything, and I feel like it's really only there to get rid of Nissa.
Exactly. And I mean, it's also, as you mentioned, with Flux, and with Village of the Angels, and also War of the Sontarans to a certain extent as well. But at least in the case of both stories, at least they're very enjoyable and watchable, and certainly the better stories of the Whittaker era. Whereas with this, it does have some interesting ideas, like in terms of, having to find the solve problem of this disease-ridden ship, and how it sort of connects to sort of the origins of the universe. Like, none of those ideas are necessarily bad. I mean, it's written by Stephen Gallagher, who did Warrior's Gate. So this is a man who clearly has a lot of ideas, but I think it's just executed in a very boring, dull manner. And I think that's its ultimate sin, really. And it kind of, it only sort of exists to try and get rid of Nissa because we want to bring in Turlo, who, after this trilogy, sort of kind of like Nissa, is just sort of to just be there, the other companion to ask questions to.
He's the Ryan of the Davison era.
Yeah, I think him and Nissa are sort of I think those two are sort of just feel like sort of, they're not great, but they're not bad. They're just very in the middle, those two. Whereas Tegan is obviously easily by far and away the most interesting character, and Adric is certainly, well, the less said about Adric, the better.
Terminus, it's not absolutely abysmal. It's just boring and dull, and I don't really care about it. I thought we'd do one more good story, and then we'd each go on to our number one favorite and least favorite. And this might be a curveball, but Castrovalva. I really enjoyed Castrovalva.
Yeah, even though it's not in my top 5, I do think this is a good, solid story, and I will give it credit for an introduction to the Doctor. I appreciated that they were at least trying to do make it much more creative, because you have tackling these sort of weird concept of, the Escher concept and how that incorporates into Castrovalva, and it just certainly makes it much more unique and creative, as opposed to something like, say, Robot, which it feels like just a generic giant robot mad scientist story. So I appreciate that they went a bit more experimental with this one.
Yeah, it's very bold and ambitious to do something like this. You've got obviously all the weird, trippy Escher style stuff, and I think it's made a lot better by the updated CGI we got in the Series 19.
Definitely.
Blu-ray. It looked pretty good before with the budget they had, but now it looks brilliant. And people often criticize the middle of it, where you've got Tegan and Nyssa just wandering around the forest. Yeah, it's not that bad. I think Nyssa is bearable and Tegan isn't too bad. I quite like how Adric wasn't in it. They captured Adric, and they had to save him, sort of. And I feel this was sort of the start of Ainley becoming the mustache twirling villain that he does sort of become. He's very generic villain, Doctor, I've kidnapped your companion, you'll have to come and rescue him, I'm going to disguise. He the Delgado's master had a lot more depth to him. He was kind of the Doctor's friend as well. And
absolutely.
He wanted to be the Doctor's friend. Look at Colony in Space. He's we can rule the universe together. I feel there's a lot more depth to his character, whereas with Ainley, all of that's scrapped, and he's just, haha, I want to be evil and rule the universe.
Yeah, absolutely. You look at Delgado, and also it's the same situation with Michelle Gomez as Master as well. She's tried to create as much destruction as possible, yet she just wants to be the Doctor's friend as well. And I just didn't really get the sense of any of that with Anthony Ainley. He does have some good stories later on. I think he was good in The Five Doctors and even Survival as well. But for most of the time, I just never really saw the appeal with his Master. I just felt like, oh, it's just another Master. That's kind of what I got from him throughout most of his stories, and even with Castrovalva, I know he wants to create this. He wants to kill the Doctor, but going as far as to create a whole village and world with its own population from scratch, just to trap the Doctor, just seems like a little bit over ambitious, even for the Master.
It's a very unrealistic villain, in the sense that Delgado, his plans were a lot more sort of believable, in the sense that for Colony in Space, he's smart about it. He pretends to be this adjudicator. He sneaks into this abandoned place underground and hacks into the Doomsday Weapon. It's it makes sense. And even Frontier in Space, he uses disguises and trickery to get what he wants, whereas with Anthony Ainley, it's just he's magic and can do what he wants.
Yeah, and exactly, it's the same situation with him, in The King's Demons. He's just on time flight, or even in Mark of the Runaway, he's just using disguises, but they don't really serve any purpose. It's just oh, it's the Master in disguise. It just feels like a gimmick rather than having it be cleverly woven into the story. And it's a shame, because, as I said, there's a lot of great stuff in Castrovalva, a lot of great ideas. I just feel like the Master kind of gets in the way a little bit, to a certain extent.
Yeah, I feel like that the Master didn't need this. We still need to find a way to get Adric out of the story, because I feel that's where it shines. But do it in a way without the Master, and have it just be a weird cosmic thing has caused a space-time trap inside Castor Alva, and it represents the Doctor's like confusion after regeneration. That'd be perfect. Yeah. And it almost does that, but with the Master. Yeah, I don't know. So that's the bulk of the video done. Now we're going to talk about 4 more stories, each of our number 1 favorite and least favorite. So I can see some very I can see us having the same favorite and least favorite, to be honest, because lots of people do. Least favorite, Ryan, go on.
Well, my least favorite, very quickly, I've already mentioned my number 5 to number 3. My number 2 is Time Flight, and as bad as that story is, it doesn't hold a candle to my number 1 worst story, which is to this day still even the worst story of all of Doctor Who in general, Warriors of the Deep. Oh my goodness. This was a shambles of a story. And it's a case of how behind the scenes problems can bleed out into the production. I mean, back then, Margaret Thatcher called a general election, and as a result, they lost about, I think, 2 weeks. It was 2 weeks of like studio work, so everything had to be done on the fly. Lots of scenes had little to no rehearsal, which is why a lot of the performances just felt either dry or rushed. It's overlit as hell. The Silurians and Sea Devils are just treated absolutely poorly, just waddling about like as if they're geriatric penguins, as I mentioned on KerVAM.
Yes.
And, of course, the Merker, which was the ultimate pantomime horse from hell, who was finished about I think it was nearly an hour before it was due in on set. So the actors inside had little to no rehearsal, and as a result, they felt like it smelt of glue inside it, and they said it was the closest they felt to glue sniffing inside, which in a way you could almost say that this story kind of made people abuse drugs to a certain extent.
That's how bad it is.
Yeah, it's just an absolute dumpster pile. And in a way, I feel like in a lot of ways, this felt like the beginning of the end of Doctor Who for me. Whereas, I mean, I know Twin Dilemma gets a lot of that, but for me, Twin Dilemma was just merely the end result, the confirmation of what started in Warriors of the Deep in terms of, okay, the end of Doctor Who is clearly in insight, and there may be terrible stories throughout the years, whether it's the aforementioned Time Flight and Arc of Infinity, or the Twin Dilemma, good chunk of Trial of a Time Lord, Battle of Ramsgate Apolos on most of Flux, but to this day, Warriors of the Deep is still the absolute bomb of the barrel for me.
Yeah, exact same for me, and probably a lot of other people. It's just, I mean, there's only one slight area of credit I can give it, in that it's not boring, overly. Like it's laughable. It's hilarious how awful it is. Like it's not boring. Like I find like Terminus dull, but even so, this is it's just production hell. You can just tell how bad of a production this was. Like with all the behind the scenes stuff. It's very, very clear that they did not have much time to do this. The whole fight scene, oh my God, with the Merker and the people shooting at it, and then I'm not surprised that Michael Grade chose this to on Room 101 in 2003, I think it was, as we were saying on KerVAM. I would have chosen the same thing if I were Michael Grade. Not to mention, he completely ignored some other stories like Five Doctors and Caves of Androzani, but still, it's just, you covered most of it, to be honest. It's just awful. It's so bad, and quite sad, as you said, it symbolizes how it's going to go downhill from here.
Yeah, I think it's the only Doctor Who story that I would give a 1 out of 10 to. I mean, at least with some other stories, as bad as say Arc of Infinity is, at least I could find a positive in it that raises it like an extra point. Whereas with Warriors of the Deep, I struggle to find anything that's truly good about it, and so for me, that's why it earns a 1 out of 10 for me.
Yeah. On a more positive note, and I can imagine we're going to choose the same story here as well. Ryan, what
Yeah.
is your favorite Peter Davison story?
Yeah, well, again, very quickly, I'm in my top 5. I mentioned I put The Awakening at number 5, Earthshock at 4, The Visitation is my number 3, and coming in very close. Now, this would have been my number 1, which is Enlightenment. I absolutely love Enlightenment. I think it's a truly great creative story, and this would have been my number 1 if not for a certain story that came at the very end of his run, and that is, of course, the case of Androzani.
How could it not be?
Still one of the best regeneration stories for a Doctor, and truly one of the best stories of Doctor Who in general. The fact that Robert Holmes by then was kind of a bit burnt out after. He did a few good stories. His last truly great one before that was probably the Reboss operation, and ever since then he's just kind of a bit burnt out. And even though he was tasked to do the 5 Doctors, the overwhelming shopping list of what he had to do, that just again left him feeling even more burnt out. So the fact that he got to come back and write an absolute masterpiece of a story it just goes to show why he was such a major important figure in Doctor Who's long history. And even now, I'm still amazed that they managed to get away with some of the content in this story by just how incredibly bleak and dark and messed up it is, and which goes to show just how much it sticks in your memory, and the fact that there is no real true heroes and villains in this story. There's pretty much, it's all murkiness and backstabbing on all sides, whether it's with Morgus' side or Sharaz Jek's side. It's such a truly layered Doctor Who story, and Sharaz Jek is such an amazing character that is so full of hate and yet has a lot of deep sadness to him as well, which is why he's such a very memorable character. And of course, it got to show Peter Davison at his absolute best, and showing a regeneration story where it's sort of where everything is sort of happening to the Doctor, that he doesn't affect the plot, he doesn't change anything. It's just basically a fight for survival, basically, with him and Perry. And then at the end, he ends up sacrificing his own life. He's regenerated his own life just to save Perry, even though he barely knows her. And it's such a great story for Peter Davison. And it was the story that made him regret leaving as soon as he did it, because he stated that he felt like he finally truly nailed the character of the Doctor with this. And you can definitely see that. And it just goes to show why it's still a truly phenomenal story, even after all this time. And in a way, it does leave me wishing that the rest of his era was like this, because if he had a lot of great stories like this, he could have been one of the better Doctors.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to say that this is the first episode of The Best and Worst of Who where both me and the guest have agreed on at least one of the categories even, but this time we've agreed on both, and yeah, my favorite is The Caves of Androzani.
Wow, awesome.
It's the first time we've agreed on one, let alone two. It's just, what can I say? It's just a fantastic character study, not necessarily into the Fifth Doctor, but the Doctor himself. Like, it just shows his character in pure form, and him, how he would just, sorry, I'm rambling a bit, how to the extreme lengths he would go to save someone that he barely knows, in this case Perry. He's known for very, very little amount of time, yet he's like pretty much, well, yeah, sacrificed one of his regenerations for her. It's crazy. And what you said about all the darkness, and it's very bleak and grim, and it's basically just the Doctor and Perry getting caught in this huge crossfire. The world building of Androzani is fantastic. Like it's so developed in every single in every storyline we've got going on. You know, what with Morgus, with Shara's Jack, with everything, and the cliffhangers as well, I feel that absolutely deserve some recognition. Like we got the first one where the Doctor and Perry are covered in the cloths, and then we've got like the shot of all the guns lining up, and it's like fire, and then they all shoot, and it lines up with the outro sting. I think it's fantastic. I can't remember the one for episode 2, but episode 3 as well is just fantastic. Like I've got to save my friend, and I'm not going to let you stop me now. And then it just really dramatic crash, and then the end is just, I can't say much. The only thing that's slightly bad about it is the fact that they chose the twin dilemma to be after it.
Yeah, that is definitely what sort of hurt it. And I think one other thing I will say is that I wish this was Robert Holmes's last script.
Yeah.
Because all the other ones he's done since have just, you can tell he was clearly, by this point, he got out all the good material he could give, and this was sort of a great endpoint. But after that, he did, the 2 Doctors, which I really don't like, and then, of course, Trial of a Time Lord, which was just an absolute mess, and it was kind of what pushed him to an early grave, unfortunately. And so I kind of wish he sort of ended it with Caves of Androzani, and the fact that you had the absolute dumpster fire that is the twin dilemma come after this. Whether we like it or not, it did signal another drastic change for the show. Maybe not the best, in my opinion, but you can clearly tell that there was some change in the air by the end of this story. I just wish it was turned out for the best.
Yeah. And that's quite a good way to round off the video. Both of us choosing the same favorite and least favorite. How could it not be? The Caves of Androzani is probably the most iconic Doctor Who story for being pretty awesome. Just an understatement. Out of curiosity, Ryan, out of every Doctor Who story ever made, where does Caves of Androzani rank there?
Oh, it's a real tough one. I don't think it's in my top 5.
Yeah.
It's not in my top 5, but it's somewhere in my top 10 to top 15. It's definitely in that sort of area, within 10 to 15. It is high on the list, absolutely.
Yeah, it's the same for me. It's I've got like the spreadsheet where I rate every Doctor Who story. It's probably a bit weird doing that, but out of 100, and this I gave it a 94, and this is 14th out of the 252. I'm pretty sure it is Doctor Who stories I've watched. So very good, but there's 13 that I think are better than it.
And I will say this is definitely also one of the strongest farewells for a story. This, War Games, and the sort of end trilogy for Capaldi with World Enough and Time, The Doctor Falls, and Twice Upon a Time. These sort of 3 for stories for the Doctor, I think have been the best farewells for a Doctor. Definitely the most strongest to date, at least.
Yeah. Speaking of the War Games, that's actually my favorite Doctor Who story ever.
Yeah, it's definitely, that is definitely in my top 10. Absolutely, that's definitely firmly in my top 10. That story, I love the War Games. It's probably my favorite, not just my favorite Troughton story, but also my favorite story of the 60s overall.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fantastic, but it's been great having you on. Thank you for agreeing to do this on fairly short notice.
It's okay. It's all well and good. Definitely a good opportunity to talk about an era of the show, which, even though it's not my favorite, it's definitely worth discussing about. Absolutely.
Yeah. So yes, that's a wrap for this episode, everyone. I hope you enjoyed. Please do like the video if you enjoy it, as usual. Subscribe if you like my content, and please do leave a comment below with your opinions on both the Peter Davison era and your opinions on our opinions of the Peter Davison era, because I've had a lot of people disagree and strongly agree with me. So I can certainly see a lot of people having very similar number one favorite and least favorite to us, Ryan.
Definitely.
Yes. So yeah, I'll be back in a couple of weeks. Actually, no, I'll be back in exactly a week's time with the discussion of the Sixth Doctor with Luke. And yeah, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, everyone. Well, listening, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.